New Mexico Territory, late spring of 1887. The sun hung like a copper coin over the main street of Socorro, casting hard shadows across wooden storefronts and faces that had learned not to ask too many questions. The air tasted of alkali dust and something meaner, the particular silence that settles when decent people decide to look away. A crowd had formed outside the land office, not for auction or announcement, but for something that happened often enough to have its own unspoken rules. Her name was Wanda Holley, 26 years old, dark hair pinned back severe, gray dress clean but threadbare at the collar. She stood beside her husband, not her father, her husband, while Dylan Brown explained her like a failed crop. 6 years married, he said, voice carrying the flat certainty of a man reading a ledger. No children, no prospects. I've got a woman who can produce waiting in Albuquerque, and this one's just taking up space. No one gasped. No one intervened. A few men nodded like they understood the economics. Women studied the dirt or their children's faces, relief visible in their posture, grateful it wasn't them. She cooks adequate, keeps a house, doesn't talk back much anymore, Dylan continued, hands in his pockets like he was discussing livestock. She's barren, but she's got years left in her for work. Somebody might find use for that. Wanda didn't cry. She'd cried 3 years ago when the midwife confirmed what Dylan already believed. She'd cried 18 months ago when he brought it up at Sunday supper in front of his mother. She'd cried 6 months ago when he started sleeping in the barn. Tears had purchased her nothing, so she stood with her spine straight and her eyes fixed on the water trough across the street, hands clasped in front of her like she was already a widow at her own funeral. Dylan's sister watched from the general store doorway, arms crossed, face carefully blank. She'd known this was coming. Everyone had. Then the crowd shifted and a man stepped through. Tall, broad through the shoulders, trail-worn canvas coat darkened with sweat at the seams. His hat sat low enough that the shadow cut across a face weathered past easy reading. But what caught attention were the 5 children behind him, stair-stepped from maybe 12 down to 5, silent as stones, watching everything with the hollow wariness of young things who'd learned the world breaks people. He didn't approach Wanda, didn't inspect her hands or teeth, didn't ask questions. He walked straight to Dylan, pulled a leather purse from inside his coat, and counted out coins on the land office railing. The sound of silver on wood was the only conversation. Dylan's eyebrows rose. "That's more than asked," he said, surprised into honesty. "You know she can't—" "She's not broken," the man said, voice low and final as a shovel on packed earth. "She's finished being judged for things that ain't her fault." He didn't wait for a response, didn't take Wanda's arm or claim her like property. He simply turned, looked at her once, just long enough for her to understand the door was open, then walked back toward his children. Dylan pocketed the money without ceremony. Wanda stood there for 3 heartbeats, aware that every person in that street would remember this moment and reshape it into whatever story made them comfortable. Then she walked after the man with 5 silent children, leaving behind her name, her marriage, and every person who'd watched her be traded like a mule with bad wind. The crowd dispersed before the dust settled. By nightfall, half of Socorro would say they hadn't seen it happen. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this story, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The ranch appeared at dusk, a collection of weathered structures hunkered against the wind like they'd been there long enough to forget why. The main house leaned slightly east, its porch sagging in the middle. Outbuildings clustered nearby, functional but worn, everything painted in shades of dust and resignation. Tony stopped the wagon without ceremony. The children climbed down and scattered to chores they'd learned to do without being told. "That's the house," Tony said, his first words in 4 hours. "Room off the kitchen, pumps out back, suppers at sundown." He didn't show her inside, didn't introduce the children properly, just unhitched the horses and walked toward the barn, shoulders carrying the weight of a man who'd stopped expecting comfort from anything. Wanda stood in the yard, carpetbag in hand, and understood with sudden clarity that she had not been rescued. She had been relocated. The children were named eventually. Through observation more than introduction, Samuel, 12, moved through the house like he was apologizing for taking up space. He did twice the work of any adult and never met her eyes. Ruthie, 10, watched Wanda with the cold assessment of someone deciding whether to invest trust. Her clothes were boys' hand-me-downs, her hair chopped short and practical. The twins, 8-year-old James and Jane, communicated in glances and half-finished sentences. They existed in their own sealed world, allowing no entry, and Caleb, 5, silent as stone, who clutched a wooden horse carved smooth by anxious fingers and spoke to no one. They orbited around her carefully, the way animals circle something they haven't decided is safe. That first night, Wanda attempted supper. The stove was temperamental, the supplies minimal. She burned the cornbread, under-seasoned the beans, served it too late because she couldn't find plates that matched or a pot that didn't leak. The children ate without comment. Tony ate without looking up. No one thanked her, no one complained. They simply consumed what was offered and disappeared to corners of the house where she wasn't invited. Wanda tried conversation. "How old are—" Ruthie stood and left. She tried help. "Can I mend—" Samuel shook his head and walked away. The twins pretended she didn't exist. Caleb watched her like she was weather, something that happened regardless of his opinion. Tony spoke once before bed. "There's a bolt on your door. Use it if you want." Not threat, not comfort, just information. Late that night, Wanda sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen, a space that smelled of lye soap and abandonment. Through the thin walls, she heard Tony's boots on the porch, the creak of him settling into what must be a chair, the strike of a match. She could leave, walk back to Socorro in the dark, throw herself on someone's mercy. Except mercy was what got her sold in the first place. Dylan had called her disposable. This house called her nothing at all. But nothing was a negotiation, not a verdict. Wanda lay back on the mattress that someone else had died on and stared at ceiling beams that didn't care whether she stayed or left. By morning, she'd decided she hadn't survived 6 years of Dylan Brown to be defeated by silence. Wanda began with what she could control. The kitchen first, scrubbing surfaces that hadn't been properly cleaned since whoever came before her gave up or gave out. She found mouse droppings in the flour bin, rust on the good skillet, a Dutch oven with a crack that leaked but could be positioned just right to hold stew. She didn't ask permission, she simply worked. By the third day, meals appeared on time. Cornbread rose properly. Coffee didn't taste like mud. The children ate with the same silence, but they stopped leaving food on their plates. By the first week, she'd mended every piece of clothing she could find. Shirts with seams splitting, dresses with hems dragging dirt, socks worn through at the heel. She left them folded on beds without announcement. Ruthie found her pants repaired and stared at Wanda across the breakfast table like it was a trap. But she wore them the next day. The chaos revealed itself slowly, in the patterns only attention could see. James hoarded biscuits in his pockets. She found them later, wrapped in cloth, hidden under his mattress like currency against future hunger. So she started leaving extra bread on the counter at night, wrapped and obvious. Within days, the hoarding stopped. Jane refused to sleep alone. Every morning, Wanda found her curled against the twins' bedroom door, having dragged a blanket from her own room after dark. So Wanda moved Jane's bed closer to James's without comment. The girl never thanked her, but she stopped sleeping on the floor. Caleb, silent Caleb, flinched at thunder. During the first storm, Wanda found him wedged behind the woodpile, wooden horse clutched white-knuckled, eyes squeezed shut. She didn't pull him out, she just sat nearby, within reach but not touching. and hummed something her own mother had hummed once, back when comfort was still possible. When the thunder passed, Caleb emerged. He didn't speak, but the next storm he came and sat beside her before the first crack of lightning split the sky. Tony noticed. He never said so, but Wanda caught him watching. The way the children moved easier through morning routines, how Samuel's shoulders didn't hunch quite so defensively, how Ruthie almost smiled once when the twins made her laugh. The house ran smoother like a wagon wheel finally greased. One evening, Tony paused at the kitchen doorway, hat in hand. "The mending," he said. "That's good work." Not thanks, not praise, just acknowledgement. Wanda nodded once and he left. She stopped waiting for permission after that, stopped watching for approval or acceptance. She simply existed in the space she'd claimed through competence and repetition. There was power in that, the kind Dylan had never let her access. 3 weeks after her arrival, Wanda sat at the kitchen table after supper, accounts spread before her, trying to make sense of Tony's record-keeping. The children had scattered to their usual corners. Then Samuel approached, hesitant, carrying a ledger. "The numbers," he said quietly. Could you show me how you organize them?" He didn't sit immediately, didn't assume welcome. But when Wanda gestured to the chair beside her, he took it. And for the first time since the day she stopped belonging to anyone, Wanda felt something shift that wasn't just survival. It was the beginning of being chosen back. The fever came on fast. Caleb woke before dawn, whimpering, the first sound Wanda had heard him make beyond breathing. She found him curled tight, skin hot enough to sear, the wooden horse fallen from his grip. "Tony!" she called, voice cutting through the pre-dawn stillness. He appeared in the doorway within seconds, still pulling suspenders over his shoulders. Took one look at Caleb and went rigid. "I'll ride for the doctor. No time," Wanda said, already moving. "Get me cool water, clean rags, whiskey if you have it." Tony hesitated. One beat, maybe two, weighing authority against urgency. Then he left to get what she'd asked for. The other children gathered like sentries. Samuel hovered near the door, fists clenched. Ruthie stood beside the bed, jaw tight. The twins pressed together, watching with the hollow-eyed terror of children who'd lost someone this way before. Wanda stripped Caleb's sweat-soaked nightshirt, pressed cool rags to his forehead, his chest, the pulse points at his wrists and neck. His breathing came shallow and fast. His eyes rolled, unfocused. "Stay with me," she murmured, words steady even as her hands trembled. "You stay right here." Tony returned with water, supplies. He stood at the foot of the bed, useless and knowing it. "What do you need?" "Space," Wanda said. Not cruel, just true. He nodded and herded the other children out, though they resisted like leaving meant permission for the worst to happen. The fever peaked near noon. Caleb convulsed once, body arching. Wanda held him down, gentle but firm, and pressed a rag soaked in cool water to his lips, coaxing drops onto his tongue. "Come on," she whispered, come on back." His eyes focused, just for a moment, just enough. "Ma," he breathed, barely audible, maybe not even meant. Wanda went still. The word hung in the air like something fragile, something that could shatter if acknowledged wrong. She didn't cry, didn't correct him, didn't say anything at all. She just kept working, kept the rags cool, kept the water coming, kept her hands steady even as something fundamental shifted in her chest. By evening, the fever broke. Caleb slept, real sleep, not the thrashing half-death of before. His breathing evened. Color returned. Wanda slumped in the chair beside his bed, exhaustion hitting like a physical blow. The door creaked. Tony stood there, holding a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for. "He called you, Ma," Tony said quietly. Not a question, not an accusation, just a fact presented for examination. Wanda looked at Caleb's sleeping face, at the wooden horse she'd placed back in his hand. "I heard," she said. Silence stretched between them, the kind that rearranges things. The others heard too, Tony added. They didn't correct him. Wanda met his eyes then, saw something in them she hadn't seen before. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that she'd become load-bearing, that the structure of this family now rested partially on her shoulders. He didn't mean anything by it, she said, offering him an exit. Maybe, Tony said. Or maybe he did. He left the coffee on the side table and walked out, closing the door with care. Wanda sat in the chair as daylight faded, listening to Caleb breathe and the house settle around her. She'd come here as a transaction, a discarded thing given temporary shelter, but somewhere between the mending and the storms and the moment a 5-year-old called her Ma, while burning with fever, she'd stopped being temporary. She was here now, not because anyone required it, because she'd been chosen by the people who mattered most. Socorro looked smaller than Wanda remembered. 2 months had passed since the day she'd stood in this street and been sold like damaged goods. Now she walked beside Tony's wagon while the children scattered to their errands. Samuel to the feed store, Ruthie to collect mail, the twins to the mercantile with a carefully written list. Caleb held Wanda's hand without self-consciousness. She noticed people noticing, saw recognition flicker across faces, followed by careful neutrality. No one approached. No one asked questions. They'd all been witnesses. None wanted to be reminded. Then Dylan Brown stepped out of the land office. His new wife hung on his arm, younger than Wanda, rounded with obvious pregnancy, dressed in blue calico that still held its color. Dylan wore satisfaction like a new hat. "Well," he said, voice carrying, "Wanda Holley, or is it Gardner now? I forget how that works with bought women." The street went quiet in the way it had before, the particular silence of people who'd watched tragedy but wouldn't intervene. Wanda's hand tightened on Caleb's. She said nothing. Dylan stepped closer, emboldened by her silence. "I see Gardner got use out of you after all. Nursemaid work suits the Barren well enough, I suppose. Rebecca here," he gestured to his wife. "She'll give me 3 sons before your replacement's even broken in." Rebecca looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Tony appeared from the freight office. He moved without hurry, positioning himself beside Wanda with the same deliberate calm he brought to everything. "Brown," he said, no greeting, just acknowledgement. Dylan grinned. "Gardner, I trust you got your money's worth? She cooks adequate if you—" "She manages a household of 6, Tony interrupted, voice level as a carpenter's plane. "Keeps accounts I couldn't balance myself. Mends, plants, preserves. Nursed my youngest through fever that should have killed him. Taught my daughter to read past primer level. Got my eldest to stop carrying grief like a weapon." He paused, then continued with the same flat precision. "She's worth more than any transaction I've ever made, and I've made plenty." The street held its breath. Dylan's smile faltered. "I wasn't saying—" "You were," Tony said. "You sold a woman for failing at something that takes 2 people. Then you stood here trying to diminish her again because it makes your choices feel justified." He looked at Dylan's pregnant wife with something almost like pity. "I hope Rebecca understands what conditional love costs." Tony turned to Wanda. "We're done here." They walked away, Wanda, Tony, Caleb still clutching her hand, while the crowd processed what they'd witnessed. Dylan stood diminished, his triumph soured, his wife's face carefully blank. On the ride home, Caleb fell asleep against Wanda's side. The other children chattered about their purchases. Tony drove without speaking, but his jaw had loosened. His shoulders dropped. Wanda watched Socorro disappear behind them and felt something she hadn't expected. Not vindication, not triumph, just the quiet certainty that Dylan's narrative no longer mattered. He'd written her story once. Disposable, broken, finished. But here, in this wagon full of children who called her Ma, and a man who'd defended her worth in the only currency that mattered, she'd become something Dylan couldn't diminish. She'd become necessary, and necessity, she was learning, was its own kind of freedom. The night was heavy with August heat when Wanda went to check the chickens. She'd heard something, a sound that didn't belong in the careful rhythm of evening chores. The children were asleep. Tony was somewhere between the barn and the far fence line, fixing posts by moonlight because daylight wasn't long enough for everything that needed doing. Wanda carried the lantern low, its circle of light small and insufficient. The man appeared from the shadows near the henhouse, one of the seasonal hands Tony had hired for harvest. Younger than Tony, older than Samuel. She'd seen him watching her during meals, his attention lingering in ways that made her skin prickle. He smelled like whiskey and something meaner. "Evening, Mrs. Gardner," he said, the title mocking in his mouth. "Or is it still Holley? Hard to keep track with bought women." Wanda stepped back. "You should sleep it off." He moved closer, not running, just closing distance with the confidence of someone who'd decided consequences didn't apply. "I'm just thinking," he said, voice loose and dangerous. "If Gardner paid for you once, maybe you're available for rent." Wanda's hand tightened on the lantern. Her voice stayed level. "Walk away." "Or what? You'll tell your—" He didn't finish. Tony appeared from the darkness like something summoned. No warning, no announcement. One moment absent, the next there, solid and final between Wanda and the hand. The confrontation lasted 3 seconds. Tony's fist connected once, precise, controlled, purposeful. The hand went down hard, stayed down. Tony stood over him, breathing steady, not a hair displaced. "Get off my land," Tony said quietly. "You've got 10 minutes to pack and 20 to be gone. If I see you in the territory again, we'll have a different conversation." The hand scrambled up and ran. Wanda stood there, lantern trembling in her grip, adrenaline making her bones feel liquid. Tony turned to her. "You hurt?" She shook her head. "Scared?" "Yes," she admitted. He nodded like that was reasonable. "He won't be back. None of them will try again." Not comfort, just information. They walked back to the house, in silence. Tony checked the doors, the windows, moved through the space with military efficiency. Then he stopped at the threshold of Wanda's room. "You're under this roof," he said, meeting her eyes. "That makes you mine to protect, not mine to own, mine to protect. There's a difference." Wanda understood what he was offering. Not possession, not romance. Just the promise that violence would not reach her while he drew breath. "Thank you," she said. Tony nodded once and left, but paused at the end of the hallway. "The bolt on your door," he said without turning. "It's for your peace of mind, not my access. You understand?" Wanda closed her door but didn't slide the bolt. She sat on the edge of the bed, pulse still hammering, and processed what had just happened. Tony had defended her without hesitation, without theater, without claiming anything in return. Dylan had called protection ownership. Every kindness a debt she owed. Every moment of safety something she'd pay for later in compliance or gratitude or silence. But Tony had drawn a line that protected her from the world and from himself. That was the difference between a man who bought a woman because he wanted something and a man who bought a woman because she deserved better than what she'd been given. Trust, Wanda realized, wasn't built through declarations or promises. It was built through moments like this, when safety didn't come with conditions, and protection didn't require surrender. She lay back and, for the first time since arriving, slept without the bolt drawn. The drought came slow, then all at once. By September, the creek ran shallow enough to count stones. By October, it stopped running altogether. The sky stayed blue and merciless, day after day, while crops withered and cattle grew gaunt, searching for grass that had turned to powder. Tony worked dawn to dark and past it, hauling water, rotating pastures, rationing feed. His face went gray with exhaustion. His hands developed tremors he tried to hide. Wanda watched him push past the point where pushing made sense, driven by something deeper than logic. This land was all he had left of the woman who'd died here. Losing it meant losing her twice. She understood, but understanding didn't stop what was coming. Tony collapsed while checking fence line. Samuel found him 2 hours later, conscious but unable to stand, fever burning through him like wildfire through dry timber. It took Samuel and Wanda both to get him onto the wagon, and by the time they reached the house, Tony was delirious. The North Field needs water. The North Field's gone, Wanda said, stripping his sweat-soaked shirt. You need to focus on not dying. For 3 days, Tony burned. Wanda moved through the house like a general marshalling limited forces. She set Samuel to managing livestock with instructions so precise he couldn't fail. She sent Ruthie and the twins to scavenge every vegetable that hadn't completely died. She rationed what remained in the pantry with mathematics that left no room for waste. Caleb sat beside Tony's bed, wooden horse in hand, keeping watch like a small soldier. At night, Wanda sat with the accounts, calculating how long they could last. The numbers offered no comfort, but giving up wasn't in the arithmetic. On the 4th morning, she found it. One tomato plant, impossibly green, tucked in the shadow of the house where the rain barrel had dripped before going dry. It shouldn't have survived. Everything around it had surrendered to dust and heat, but there it stood, stubborn, implausible, alive. Wanda stared at it for a long moment. Then she carried water from their drinking supply and gave the plant a cup. Not enough to waste, just enough to say, "You're not done yet." Tony woke that afternoon. His eyes opened clear for the first time in days. He tried to sit up. Wanda pushed him back down. "Stay," she said. He looked around the room, neat, organized, functioning. Looked at Caleb asleep in the chair. Looked at Wanda, who hadn't slept more than an hour at a time since he'd fallen. "The ranch," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Still standing. The children. Fed, working, alive. The livestock. Samuel's managing." Tony processed this. "How long was I?" 4 days. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something had shifted. "I told you," Wanda said quietly. "You're not allowed to die. I didn't survive Dylan Brown just to lose this place to your stubbornness." Tony almost smiled. Almost. "The crops? Mostly gone," she admitted, "but there's a tomato plant by the house that refuses to quit. I figure if it can survive, so can we." Tony looked at her then, really looked, saw what she'd become in the months since he'd paid Dylan Brown, and walked away. She wasn't the broken woman from Socorro's street. She was the center this family turned on, the reason they'd survive what should have destroyed them. "You held it together," he said. "We held it together," Wanda corrected. "That's how this works now." Tony nodded, too exhausted to argue. But as Wanda left to check on supper, he understood something fundamental. He'd bought her freedom from judgment. She'd earned her place through everything that came after. They arrived in November when the land looked most defeated. 2 men in pressed suits and polished boots, the kind that had never touched a shovel. They represented investors from back east, they said, men interested in consolidating properties for railroad expansion. Tony received them on the porch. Wanda stood in the doorway, dish towel in hand, listening. "We're prepared to offer well above market value," the taller one said, opening a leather case. "Enough to relocate comfortably, start fresh somewhere the land's more forgiving." The number he named made Wanda's breath catch. It was more money than she'd seen in her lifetime, enough to ensure the children's futures, enough to buy land that actually produced, cattle that wouldn't starve, security against every drought and disaster yet to come. "The ranch isn't profitable," the second man added, voice reasonable. "You lost most of your crop this year. Another season like that and you'll lose everything anyway. We're offering you a choice." Tony looked at the papers, looked at his land, stubborn, difficult, half dead from drought but still standing. Looked back at the men. "No." The word dropped like a stone. "Mr. Gardner," the tall one tried again, "perhaps you should discuss this with—" "There's nothing to discuss. The amount is negotiable. The land isn't." After they left, disappointed and confused, Wanda found Tony in the barn. He was working leather, hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who needed something to do while his mind settled. "That money," Wanda said carefully, "it would have solved everything." Would it? She stepped closer. "The children's futures, security. No more wondering if we'll make it through winter." Tony set down his tools. "This land killed my wife," he said quietly, "but she chose it anyway. Chose the work, the struggle, the impossibility of it. She could have left. I told her to leave. She stayed." He looked at Wanda then. "You stayed too, not because you had to, because somewhere along the way, this stopped being a place you were put and became a place you chose." Wanda felt something shift in her chest, the same feeling as when Caleb first called her Ma, but deeper. "If I sell," Tony continued, "I'm saying this land's only worth what it produces, that the work, yours, mine, theirs, only matters if it turns profit." He shook his head. "That's the arithmetic that sold you in Socorro. I won't use it here." 3 days later, Samuel helped Tony plant a post at the property line. The sign read, "Not for sale. Someone was allowed to stay here." Wanda stood with the children and watched Tony hammer it secure. She understood what that sign meant. Not just refusal, but testimony. This land wasn't measured in yields or profit. It was measured in the people who'd survived it. That evening, Tony found Wanda at the kitchen table, working accounts that still didn't balance but somehow stretched far enough. "We'll make it," he said. Not a question. "We will," she agreed. He nodded and turned to go, then paused. "I paid Dylan for your freedom," he said, "but you earned your place here. Those are different things. I wanted you to know I know that." Wanda met his eyes. "This family earned me too." Something passed between them. Not love, exactly, but something stronger. Recognition, partnership. The knowledge that they'd built something together that couldn't be bought or sold or measured by any arithmetic that mattered to men in pressed suits. "Good night, Wanda." "Good night, Tony." And that, she thought, was enough. The years moved like water over stone, slow, persistent, reshaping everything. Samuel left first at 19 with a wife from town and plans to farm land of his own. He returned every harvest to help his father and later to show Wanda his children. Ruthie went to Santa Fe to teach, letters arriving monthly with stories of students who reminded her of herself. Stubborn, guarded, capable of more than anyone expected. The twins took opposite paths, James to ranching in Colorado, Jane to nursing in Albuquerque, but they came home for Christmas, always together, still finishing each other's sentences. Caleb stayed longest. He was 23 when he finally left, reluctant, apologetic. "I need to see what else is out there," he said. Wanda understood. "Go," she told him. "This place will be here when you're done looking." He was. Wanda turned gray slowly, then all at once. Her hands bent with arthritis, but never stopped moving. She tended the garden that had grown from that single stubborn tomato plant. Vegetables that shouldn't thrive in New Mexico soil, but did anyway because Wanda had decided they would. Tony aged beside her, quieter each year, his body wearing down like good tools used past their intended life. They worked the ranch together, scaled down but functional, a testament to what persistence could accomplish. They never married. It seemed unnecessary. Marriage was what Dylan had used to own her, what had made her disposable when she failed to produce. This, whatever it was between her and Tony, didn't need documents or ceremony. It existed in the work, the silence, the understanding that they'd built something together that would outlast them both. Wanda died in late spring, 71 years old, in the same room off the kitchen where she'd first slept alone and terrified. Tony found her at dawn, still and peaceful, her hands finally at rest. The children came home, all 5 of them with their own children now, filling the house with noise and grief and memory. They buried her at the edge of the property where she could see the garden and the house and everything she'd refused to abandon. Tony followed 18 months later. Not from grief, exactly, but from the simple mathematics of a body that had worked too long and too hard. Samuel found him sitting in his chair on the porch, hat in his lap, facing the land he'd never sold. They buried him beside Wanda. The children kept the ranch, not because it was profitable, it never had been, but because selling it would be erasing testimony. Their children visited summers, learned the stories, understood what their grandmother had survived to give them this place. The garden grew wild but never died. Tomatoes, squash, beans, resilient things that remembered Wanda's hands and grew anyway. And at the property line, weathered but standing, the sign remained. Not for sale. Someone was allowed to stay here. Travelers sometimes stopped to read it, confused by the phrasing, but the children knew what it meant, and they made sure their children knew. It meant a woman discarded for what she couldn't give had become irreplaceable for what she chose to build. It meant worth isn't measured by what you produce, but by what survives because you stayed. It meant some places bloom not because they are fertile, but because someone refused to leave. Years later, when the grandchildren were grown and the great-grandchildren played in that impossible garden, they would ask about the sign. And someone would tell them about Wanda, about the day she stopped belonging to anyone and started belonging to everyone who mattered, about how the land remembered her long after her hands stopped working it, about how some legacies aren't measured in harvests or profit, but in the stubborn fact of endurance. The sign still stands, the garden still grows, and the land, dry and difficult and unforgiving, remembers the woman who stayed.